I can say this is the first time I feel like I've known most of the people in the room, and it's a really good feeling. It's really nice to see all of you. This is truly going to be a special evening, and I'm so happy to welcome everyone to the 25th Annual Frank M. Coffin Lecture on Law and Public Service. Thank you all for being here this evening. My name is Danielle Conway, and I am the proud Dean of the University of Maine School of Law. Each year, that never gets old. Each year, the Frank M. Coffin Lecture on Law and Public Service provides us an opportunity to reflect on our individual and collective commitment to doing justice in our society. The Coffin Lecture also reminds those of us who are judges and lawyers that our community members are equal partners in the passionate pursuit of justice. Through service to the public in this way, the Coffin Lecture is for and about all of us. It is a calling to each of us to fulfill the challenge that Judge Frank M. Coffin issued to us, to pursue justice in whatever sphere of influence we each have, from grassroots efforts to institutional initiatives. I marvel at the prescience of our speaker selection, and further the relevance of the speaker's topic in relation to what is presently occurring at home and around the globe. In many ways, the subjects we will hear about this evening represent the road less traveled in the pursuit of justice. Where the road presents itself, usually in the form of a fork, is where we find people like our introducer, the Honorable William J. Keota Jr., and our Coffin lecturer, Ambassador Rick Barton, who both are indefatigably committed to shaping our governmental institutions to serve humanity. This evening's lecture is sure to provoke both our minds and our souls to question what each of us can do in our relative spheres of influence to address the challenges we face as a nation with respect to domestic issues that are inevitably intersecting repeatedly with international issues. Maine has a deep bench when it comes to individuals who have dedicated themselves to public service, to country, state, and to their fellow citizens and residents. Please allow me to recognize some of those among us who do vital justice work every day. First, I would like to recognize the Coffin law clerks who are with us this evening. Where are you? These clerks travel from near and far to join us in celebrating the Renaissance man, Judge Frank M. Coffin, and his partner in all of his accomplishments, Ruth E. Coffin. As many of you know, Ruth Evelyn Coffin peacefully completed her earthly life on March 7, 2017, at the very young age of 96 in her home in South Portland. She was a cherished mother, adored grandmother, proud great-grandmother, and treasured matriarch who extended her warmth and generosity to many beyond the Coffin family. We are so fortunate to have the Coffin family with us to pay tribute to both Frank and Ruth. Meredith, Susan, Douglas, thank you for honoring us with your presence and with your support. So I think that we have the wonderful Justice Donald Alexander with us representing the Maine Supreme Judicial Court. And as I call your name, please stand. Justice Alexander. and former Chief Justice of the same court and Maine Law alumnus, the Honorable Daniel E. Wathen. As well, I want to recognize Judge Kermit Lopez of the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, and Judges Nancy Torreson, John D. Levy, John A. Woodcock from the United States District Court for the District of Maine. I would also like to recognize all federal, state, and local judges serving Maine and beyond. I recognize you all intentionally, obviously because of the name of this lecture, but also because you represent a singular principle that is vital to the rule of law, and that is an independent judiciary. Thank you for your courage and your judicial temperament in service to the rule of law and to the people of Maine and the nation. I am also pleased to recognize Beth Bozang on behalf of Congresswoman Shelley Pingree, all city councilors and state representatives, and I believe I saw Mr. Delahanty in the room. Yes, please stand up and be recognized. I turn now to recognize this year's sponsor of the Judge Frank M. Coffin Lecture, the Maine chapter of the Fulbright Association, an organization representing over 150 Maine scholars and specialists. The mission of the Maine chapter of the Fulbright Association is to educate the Maine community about the impact of Fulbright scholars and their impact on American leadership, national security, local economies, international alliances, and higher education. I am proud to share with you that our small full-time faculty of 20 at Maine Law boasts 4 Fulbrights. Finally, I would like to recognize the University of Maine School of Law team, especially the students, and especially the students who have volunteered tonight, who represent the International Law Society. As well, this event would not be possible without the commitment of our staff, our faculty, and our administration, and everyone. You've probably spoken to Maggie Fleming. Thank you, Maggie. Each segment of our Maine law community, in very special ways, has pledged to defend the Constitution, to promote the rule of law, and to represent those most vulnerable in society. I truly have an amazing team of people to call colleagues. One of the many and great privileges of being Dean of the University of Maine School of Law is that I get to officiate over this lecture in honor of Judge Frank M. Coffin. Judge Coffin is one of a select few who served in all 3 branches of the United States government. He was a member of Congress from the state of Maine for 4 years in the late 1950s. He and the late Ed Muskie, the first senator and then Secretary of State, founded the modern Democratic Party in the state of Maine. Frank Coffin, not yet a judge, ran for governor in 1960. Although he came in second, he received more votes in Maine than did John F. Kennedy. He served in the Agency for International Development until 1965, when President Kennedy appointed him to the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. Judge Coffin served on the court for 40 years, 11 of those years as Chief Judge. Judge Coffin was always a staunch supporter of Maine law, but more than that, Judge Coffin groomed young people for careers aimed at lifelong service to the public. Our introduction speaker, the Honorable William J. Carter, Jr., is counted among Judge Coffin's finest mentoring achievements. Judge Carter graduated magna cum laude from both Amherst College and Harvard Law School. He served as an officer of the Harvard Law Review. He clerked for Chief Judge Frank M. Coffin of the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit from 1979 to 1980. From 1980 to 2013, Judge Kotecha maintained a nationwide trial and appellate practice at Pierce Atwood. Prior to his appointment to the bench in 2013, Judge Kotecha served as a regent in the American College of Trial Lawyers. Between 2011 and 2015, he also served as special master by appointment to the United States Supreme Court in Original Action Number 126, Kansas versus Nebraska. I now welcome Judge Kotecha.
Thank you, Dean Conway. I think I can safely say, Dean, that the people in this room and many people outside this room are glad that they can also say they know you now as well. Tonight's lecture is something of a bittersweet moment. In the wake of Ruth Coffin's passing last March, our 25th lecture will be the first held without the benefit and guidance of either Judge or Ruth Coffin. So the mantle must now be taken up in full, and I'm very pleased to say, Dean, that the law school has proven itself well up to the task. Our speaker this evening is the second out of 25 Coffin lecturers who does not have a law degree. Ambassador Barton has a BA in government from Harvard and an MBA from Boston University and an honorary doctorate from Wheaton College. He stands in excellent company. The other Coffin lecturer, who was also not a lawyer, was Arthur Schlesinger Jr. I would note another university professor who also served in the executive branch of the federal government. In introducing Professor Schlesinger, Judge Coffin said, and I quote, "The theme of law and public service is in its essence a broad concept. It reaches beyond law for the law's sake to the uses of law for the larger good." Although Ambassador Barton is neither a lawyer nor a judge, I can accurately report that he appeared on my court on many occasions before he moved south. Now, looking at him now, you'll see when he stands up, he's quite finely attired. When he first appeared in my court, he was wearing a t-shirt and shorts. I should explain that the court in question has a net across the middle. And I must also confess that given the results on most of those occasions, I was not unhappy to see it was raining during his visit here in town. The legal milieu in which Ambassador Barton has primarily toiled is that of international law and relations. The son of an American diplomat who worked throughout the Americas and in the Caribbean, Ambassador Barton heard the call of government service at an early age. Straight out of college, he worked for Maine Senator Bill Hathaway until Hathaway's defeat in late 1974. In 1976, Ambassador Barton threw himself into electoral politics, winning a hotly contested six-way nomination for the Democratic candidate for Congress from southwestern Maine. If I recall right, the motto was something like, "Barton works." He narrowly lost to the incumbent representative, David Emery. That is when I first met our speaker, and then a bit later, his wife, Kit Lunny. Portland teamed then with people of substance, erudition, and talent who sought leadership positions in our governments. George Mitchell, John O'Leary, Jock McKernan, Tom Allen, Pam Plum, Rick Barton, and many others. After working 3 years for what then was known as HEW, Ambassador Barton returned to Portland to form a strategic planning firm. Foreshadowing the future path he was to follow, he also taught at Bowdoin, and he co-founded Maine's World Affairs Council. Finally, taking the plunge into his father's world of international diplomacy, Ambassador Barton served as an election trainer and overseer in Haiti, and then worked in Poland and Ethiopia. In 1994, he joined the U.S. Agency for International Development. Now, this is the very same agency in which Frank Coffin served our country in the 1960s, before his nomination to the federal bench in 1965. Under the Clinton administration, Ambassador Barton was appointed Deputy High Commissioner of the UN Refugee Agency in Geneva, and in 2001 he was appointed to a seat on the faculty at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School, where he served as co-director of the Post-Conflict Reconstruction Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In 2009, Professor Obama seized on Rick Barton's accumulated expertise by appointing him as United States Ambassador to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, where peace building remained a driving focus of his career. 3 years later, he was confirmed by the United States Senate as a first assistant secretary in the State Department. And in 2013, looking back over what really was something of a rocket launch of a spectacular career, over a decade of work, the State Department bestowed on Ambassador Barton its Distinguished Honor Award in recognition of his work that had taken him to, I believe, roughly 40 countries to promote peace building and to empower women. Not surprisingly, peace building has been the principal object of the ambassador's career. And I expect, as you'll see from the title, it will play a major role in his lecture this evening. Peace building. It doesn't just happen, it has to be built. World War I took the lives of 18 million people, including over 100,000 Americans in just 7 months on the battlefields. Marshalling ever new and more lethal technologies, World War II took the lives of, and no one knows, 50 to 80 million people, including 400,000 Americans, at a time when our population was less than 2/3 of what it is now. Remarkably, and I say remarkably because it can't be an accident, neither World War III nor anything like World War I or World War II has followed since. Instead, United States diplomats like Frank Coffin and Rick Barton, our military forces, our businesses, our scholars, and our ordinary citizens have worked for nearly 70 years to build and nurture what to date may in very practical terms be mankind's most important construct, a mutually beneficial web of multinational relations and institutions that have held at bay the carnage that ensues either when nations fail or when strong nations simply put their short-run interests first and pursue zero-sum strategies that leave all, and most certainly our own country, worse off. We need people who build peace, so I am pleased to present Ambassador Frederick Barton. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's just wonderful to see so many old friends. It's great to be home. And of course, it's an honor to be with you tonight in this role. Special thanks to Judge Bill Kayada, my old tennis buddy. the Coffin family, who we're getting to know better today, and they have such warmth and spirit, not a surprise. Dean Conway, a joy. Jeff Thaler and Maggie for your great help and warm welcome here. Maggie Fleming of the law school, and President Glenn Cummings of the University of Southern Maine. To all of you and this group of friends who are so active members of Maine's dynamic civil society, thank you very much. Kit and I cherish our time here in Maine, and we take to heart what Judge Coffin said at a law clerk picnic in 2006. He said, "We take from all these years a feeling of the incredible variety and richness of a unique friendship community. Like many of you, I revered Frank Coffin. He seemed the perfect blend of serious public servant and Maine authentic, all served up with a charming twinkle and disarming modesty. His contributions are remarkable, as you've heard, but in addition to those that the Dean mentioned and that Bill also mentioned, he was a loving son, husband, father, grandfather, artist, and unheralded Bates football player. Maybe more about that during the question and answer period. I've gotten to know more about him than I realized. It doesn't get much better. A couple of my sweetest memories involve seeking career advice from Judge Coffin. He welcomed me into his chambers and recalled that his hardest times came when he was between public jobs, when as a congressman he suffered an unexpected gubernatorial campaign defeat in 1960, and when President Lyndon Johnson rejected his selection as ambassador to Panama and later held up his judicial appointment. Of course, there were memorable stories and laughs. He reflected on his unexpected defeat to interim Governor John Reed, who had stepped into the office upon the death of Doc Clausen of Waterville. Memories of a televised debate, which Reed chose not to attend, came forth. The debate went ahead with an empty chair, where his opponent should have been. I took on the chair with such zeal and skill, Judge Coffin recounted, that it created a backlash of sympathy. Frank Coffin's loss a few days later was due to the convergence of John Kennedy at the top of the ticket and the Maine ballot's big box. A record outpouring of rural voters fearing a Kennedy win checked the Republican box at the top of the ballot and swept Coffin away in the landslide. Even with massive straight ticket voting, Coffin ran tens of thousands of votes ahead of Kennedy. Judge Coffin told me of quiet post-election days without direction. He heard that the new Kennedy administration might call upon him, but there was silence. He wrote that his inability to convince a majority of Mainers to vote for him was humbling. Up to now, I had moved from success to success, both in law and in politics. Now I knew I had limitations. His close aide, Don Nichol, would write, he was, in his words, ready to move on. As he suffered, in quiet, finally a call came from West Palm Beach. "Will you please hold for President-elect Kennedy," the operator said. The next voice was Jack Kennedy. "Hey, Frank, we sure got the vote out, didn't we?" Jack Kennedy knew Frank Coffin and recognized that he was the kind of person to have around. On January 24th, 1961, Kennedy named Coffin the managing director of the Development Loan Fund, and when the foreign aid programs were consolidated, Coffin became the deputy of USAID, the Agency for International Development. After 4 years as a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, with a concentration on development, Frank Coffin was ready. His 1964 book, I've probably taken it out of more libraries than the rest of the room in the last few weeks, Witness for AID is full of insight, refreshing arguments, and a firm belief in the potential of the United States to make the world more peaceful. As you would expect, he took on the myth of the self-made nation. Quote, "One of the roadblocks to our reaching a sustained commitment to the objective of helping other countries develop in freedom is the haunting question, we did it all by ourselves, why can't they?" Frank Coffin went on, "The short answer is that we didn't do it all by ourselves." Coffin wrote, "To begin with, we waged a successful revolution, but 1 out of $15 was loaned to us from abroad. That margin of 7% may well have been the critical margin of resources." He went on to detail the lenient loans and international credit that made America's growth possible, including a foreign bond of $11 million to finance the Louisiana Purchase. "We were not always model debtors," Coffin wrote, and described the repudiation of debt by several states, while 9 others defaulted on interest during the lean years of 1841 and 42. Frank Coffin recognized that America benefited from the help of others and has often been generous. He recognized that America has advantages and opportunities that no other nation enjoys. He knew that American exceptionalism collides with a national reluctance, producing significant hesitancies. Frank Coffin's belief in expanding freedom and giving people a fighting chance to make it on their own with our help inspires. At the end of Witness for AID, Frank Coffin called for us to sustain our historic efforts to assist in the evolution of free, responsible, and prospering nations. He wrote, "It is a levy on the American spirit, understanding, and will. It is a call to this generation to sense a new extension of the spirit of the Declaration of Independence in an interdependent world. In responding to this call, the people of the United States will be doing far more than giving this nation the ability to endure its leadership. They will have rediscovered their national purpose. They will be serving their deepest national interest." I've thought a lot about the speech that Frank Coffin would want me to give tonight, and this is it. A full-throated call for America to give local people, wherever they live, a fair chance to thrive in peace. At the same time, he balanced this ambition with a New England mix of hopefulness and the search for constant improvement that uplifts us all, even when facing the toughest challenges. While serving as a naval officer in the Pacific during World War II, Frank shared a vision. Separated from Ruth and interrupting his law school studies, he wrote, "I am to study law with the intention of using it as a tool for social progress. I shall aim at the very top. I pray God that I shall never be blinded from seeing this social goal by any personal considerations. God give me humility, patience, ability, willpower, and humor. Could we use those same qualities to refine America's role in the world? Would greater humility, patience, ability, willpower, and humor improve the way we advance peaceful democratic change? I believe so, and want to talk tonight about one challenge where we both lead and default, where we are not always there when we are called upon: genocide and crimes against humanity. A brief modern history and my own experiences in post-genocide Rwanda make clear that America's promise could be improved if we kept Frank Coffin's core humanity in the forefront of our deeds. That is my focus tonight. As Frank Coffin knew so well, there is a better way forward. When the experiences of World War II seared the world's collective memories in the 1940s, the United States did lead. The Nuremberg Trials provided justice and addressed the mass atrocities of the Holocaust and a ferocious war that claimed, as Bill said, tens of millions of lives and caused immeasurable suffering. Individuals were held accountable for their acts, whatever positions they held. President Truman selected a Supreme Court justice to lead the effort. There would have been no Nuremberg without Robert Jackson. It was his creation, Robert King, a young American prosecutor, said of Jackson. As Jackson himself put it so well, this is the first case I have ever tried where I had to first persuade others that a court should be established, help negotiate its establishment, and when that was done, not only prepare my case, but find myself a courtroom in which to try it. The Nuremberg Trials led to the Genocide Convention. It was thought that a broader genocide agreement would avoid selective justice, where only a few extraordinary cases would receive international attention. The results were considered valuable to securing the peace for decades to come. Some worried that the Nazi war crimes trials in Nuremberg were too narrow, including Raphael Lemkin, who had developed the definition of genocide in the 1930s. Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer, was provoked by the unpunished Turkish massacre of hundreds of thousands of Armenians. Lemkin prepared a draft of a law punishing those who committed the destruction of people on the grounds of race, religion, or national origin. He wanted the concept of universal jurisdiction to apply to the law's enforcement so that violators could be tried wherever they were caught, regardless of where the crime was committed or of either defendant's nationality or official status. Abolishing genocide is about learning to value diversity. As Raphael Lemkin wrote in 1944, quote, "Our whole cultural heritage is a product of the contributions of all nations. We can best understand when we realize how impoverished our culture would be if the peoples doomed by Germany, such as the Jews, had not been permitted to create the Bible or to give birth to an Einstein, a Spinoza, if the Poles had not had the opportunity to give to the world a Copernicus, a Chopin, a Curie, the Czechs a Hus and Dvorak, the Greeks of Plato and Socrates, the Russians of Tolstoy and Shostakovich. For those of us who have pursued our own DNA trails through Ancestry.com or 23andMe, we know how rich and complex even our own family lines can be. Again, the U.S. took the lead, and the fledgling UN took up the issue. As in so many other significant cases, America led the way in negotiations. The U.S. usually has the biggest delegations, offers the most ideas and amendments, and makes the greatest demands. The United Nations Convention on Genocide passed in October 1949 and took effect in 1951. But suspicions remained in the United States. After President Harry Truman failed to gain a two-thirds vote of confirmation, no president moved the treaty to the Senate floor. While supportive, they assumed that it lacked the votes. For 40 years, the United States did not ratify the Genocide Convention. The U.S. did not follow through. Many cited potential loss of sovereignty. 10 years into his 32-year Senate career, Bill Proxmire of Wisconsin launched the tenacious campaign in 1967 to persuade the Senate to adopt the Genocide Convention. With allies and Senators Jacob Javits of New York and Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island, Proxmire spoke about the importance of ratification every single day that the Senate was in session for 20 years. Rising right after the chaplain's prayer, Proxmire would submit for the record a different reason why the U.S. should become a party to the convention that America had helped to draft. He gave 3,211 speeches. That's how many good reasons there were. In 1985, President Ronald Reagan stumbled into a public embarrassment as he left for Germany on a trip to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the end of World War II. Reagan announced his intention to visit Bitburg Cemetery, which turned out also to be the burial place of 49 Nazi officers. In the outcry that followed, Reagan made every effort to make amends, but the damage had been done. Upon his return, he threw his full support behind the Genocide Convention. With White House support, the convention was ratified by the Senate in February of 1986. The U.S. was the 98th nation to ratify. The act was signed into law by the president a few years later. 2 months before Bill Proxmire left the Senate, Proxmire was unable to attend the informal signing ceremony held outside Chicago. When I left Maine for Washington in March 1994, I had no idea that my work would lead me to a genocide within a month of my arrival. The morning that the Rwandan genocide started, on April 5th, I met with the Burundian foreign minister. It was my first month in Washington, and I knew nothing about the Great Lakes region of Africa. Let alone the two tiny countries in the heart of the continent, Rwanda and Burundi. I was at the small meeting because my new office at USAID was reputed to have liquidity, something that is always in short supply in U.S.-Africa accounts. The simplicity of the young minister impressed me. Unlike many peers, she did not drip jewelry or gold watches. She was shaking and remained agitated, and I did not appreciate why. Just hours before, the plane carrying the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi back from peace talks with the rebel forces was shot down as it approached the airport in Rwanda's capital of Kigali. All aboard died. She had received the news and feared that mass deaths would follow. In the next 100 days in the spring of 1994, machete-wielding Hutus killed 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus. The world stood by and let it play out. Despite warnings, the U.S. was absent. The U.S. did not heed them or want to hear them. To say that we missed this grotesque butchery is an understatement. A recent failure in Somalia was cited, along with the unimportance of a tiny piece of Africa. The thought that all of our humanity is diminished, insulted, and degraded by such an action was not voiced. After the Tutsis took over Rwanda, they killed thousands more as they secured the nation. I arrived for my first visit to Rwanda 2 weeks after the genocide had ended, as part of a four-person delegation headed up by America's senior human rights official. We met with victims and murderers, new officials, traumatized survivors, refugees, and dazed observers. It was too early to figure out anything. With more experience, I would later learn that every one of the conflict cases I worked on had a dominant quality. And in the case of Rwanda, it would be the centrality and recognition of the genocide and need for justice. As we talked to the acting Attorney General of Rwanda, he spoke of the three things that the new Rwandan government wanted: speedy trials in Rwanda with the death penalty. The U.S. delegation leader explained that all three would be difficult, though he thought that the Bosnia Tribunal could help to accelerate the trial since it was now through its own growing pains and might be expanded. He worried that trials in Rwanda would be seen as unfair and stated that our European allies would not support the execution of the guilty. I did not feel as if we heard the Rwandans. Over the next 3 years, my office would be at the center of advancing justice in Rwanda. It was the least we could do. After missing the genocide, the U.S. needed to do something. So much was practical, nitty-gritty, though always in pursuit of dealing with the genocide. We worried about Rwandans feeling safe, ongoing violence, collecting evidence, and finding ways to return to villages and homes where death was everywhere. Our first effort supported the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ayala Lasso, as he sought to put 100 human rights monitors all over Rwanda to provide a sense of safety. This was harder than it sounded. The UN had never undertaken such a large mission, let alone in an emergency, and Ayala Lasso, only weeks into his job, sought to convert a policy shop in Geneva into a functioning field operation. An American monitor later described the experiment this way: having the High Commissioner for Human Rights lead this effort was like asking the Library of Congress to put out a fire. There are plenty of references, but zero experience. It was an institutionally structured mess. The UN would only offer 3-month contracts, and the human rights professionals would seek certified human rights practitioners. Here was the rub. The chances of finding 100 such people with no financial guarantees to work in a potentially dangerous place on short notice were nil. We sought the help by contacting the Return Peace Corps Association in Washington to expand the talent pool and to locate a few Kenya Rwandan speakers. There was resistance at the UN to the prospect of too many Americans. When finally deployed, the monitors did not help to collect evidence. Rather, they upbraided the new Rwandan government, which had no police and few prisons, for having soldiers arrest people and excess incarcerations. The genocide went unaddressed. The first leader of the mission did not inspire confidence, and we led the effort to replace him. Almost everything was untested. Among the early lessons I took from this experience: listen to the locals, make sure that policy and practice inform and support each other, do not overpromise, be aggressive in picking the right leader, and the UN works best when its members make real contributions. Another early initiative of my office was to help the Rwandans address the immediate realities of the genocide. We placed one of the monitors, a young American lawyer, Jane Rasmussen, into the Rwandan Attorney General's office as an advisor. Together, they drafted Rwanda's new genocide law, which divided the prosecutions into 4 categories, from a lead organizer down to someone who was forced to kill. Throughout this time, the new Rwandan government kept arresting people, until the jails, which had a capacity of maybe 10,000, overflowed with close to 100,000 prisoners. We thought a random sample of 250 to 400 prisoners might give us a sense of how long formal court trials could take, and sent a statistics professor from Washington and a member of Amnesty International's board to visit a few jails in Rwanda. At her first prison, she saw that identities did not exist, nor did formal evidence. In a country where everyone was either a perpetrator or a victim, this was not going to work. The Rwandans cut short her visits, but the lessons took hold. After a few show trials and executions, the Rwandans would pursue mass informal justice in many parts of the country, the Kotecha Trials. These informal courts prosecuted 400,000 genocide suspects in 11,000 communities from 2002 to 2012 in a way that was understood by local people. The New York Times would later say, if one stated objective of judging mass violence is to reconcile divided communities, then victims and perpetrators must also be brought together again and close to the scene of the crimes. Worried that the International Tribunal was slow to collect evidence, we sent in a young prosecutor from Los Angeles. Our fears were confirmed when he was unable to do anything. Within hours of his arrival, he recognized that it would be impossible to collect evidence without the full support of the new government. They were not ready to trust outside investigators, and ideas such as witness protection did not exist. We turned up the heat on the Rwandan Tribunal and the UN's ineffectual recruiting of key personnel. That led us to help set up the prosecutor's office in Rwanda and Tanzania. Even simple things like a secure fax line to the office of the lead prosecutor, South African Judge Goldstone, the 15th Coffin lecturer in The Hague, needed to happen. The 13th. The U.S. worked with the office manager to make the basics possible. When the prosecutor in the region seemed to lack energy, we pushed for his removal and worked to identify a worthy successor. Throughout, we worried that the Rwandans' public sense of justice needed attention. In the minds of the Rwandans, justice must be seen to be done. The Rwandans wanted nothing to do with the International Tribunal for Rwanda, seeing its existence as a form of genocide denial. How could these murderers be anything but guilty, was their thought. In turn, the tribunal instinctively laid low. We thought the public must know more. An early effort brought Rwandan journalists to Arusha for the formal international trials in neighboring Tanzania. That did not work, as the Tutsi writers could not fathom the concept of innocent until proven guilty. The U.S. paid to have daily reports and bulletins written and disseminated to show the development of law. International news reporters did not come to cover the glacial proceedings for more than a few days at a time, finding the procedures and legalistic events to not be news. When the first conviction came and the principle of rape as a weapon of war surfaced, the press showed up. This did not satisfy the Rwandans, who worried that the absence of the death penalty and the presence of the International Tribunal was proof that the genocide did not take place, in their words. However, it was progress. Phrases such as acts of genocide used in the Yugoslavia Tribunal were challenged. We also paid to have the trials captured on film and broadcast inside of Rwanda. Mobile videos were made of most everything. Throughout Rwanda, gatherings saw a documentary about the Holocaust, the Genocide Convention, and the Rwandan trials. Groups of up to 700 people witnessed what was happening and engaged in responsive, interactive dialogues. Radio captured much of the trials. Justice expanded, and the genocide was recognized. Still, the formal justice activities did not touch the daily lives as much as we wanted. So we sought some form of restorative justice. A colleague wrote, quote, "In recent interviews at unaccompanied children's centers, we asked what they hoped to be doing 5 years from now. Most said they do not expect to be alive." We kept searching, listening, and looking for openings. At a near-deserted outdoor market, a vibrant and playful woman asked about our marital status. "There are not many men around here," she flirted. That was clear. At least 70% of the people we saw were women and children. This became the germ of an idea. While there had been thousands of women's associations before the genocide, a few did remain. Many continued daycare operations, more needed than ever, with so many households led by women. We also found a new ministry of women and families, with the sole woman member of the cabinet, Aloysia Nyumba, the leader of fundraising for the Tutsi rebels winners. We figured that Hutus and Tutsis might never need each other, but that men would always need women. From that came the Women in Transition program, which I'll refer to as WIT, called by the Rwandans the Projet du Mama, or the Project for the Mamas. Its big, challenging objective in the aftermath of a genocide was to quickly provide direct support to large numbers of vulnerable women to enable them to live, sustain themselves, their families, and begin to reestablish basic relationships, trust, and peace within their communities. Even for somebody who talks a lot, I don't usually talk this long. In a visit to a town on the Congo border, a team member spoke to women benefiting from WIT support. My colleague wrote, "One young woman quietly talked of her past and the horrible and miserable ordeal of being on the run with Interahamwe, the youth groups that killed so many. She recalled how her mother became exhausted due to the constant movement and how she had stated her intention to return to her home commune. The Interahamwe shot and killed her mother. The daughter decided to keep quiet and eventually escaped. The WIT team revisited and monitored the women's groups in the area on several occasions. With each trip, we observed an increase in the women's spirits, better clothes, improved health, and even some evidence of visits to the local salon de coiffure. Equally visible was an increase of land and agricultural production and a decrease in military patrols. An association member stated, not only do the families of the 15 WIT-funded women's associations have Irish potatoes to eat, but all families can now afford to buy potatoes and feed their families. My colleague doubted it. He said, I wasn't sure about all, but potato prices throughout Rwanda dropped more than 50% within a year, and in some communes, more. In Mutura, the fourth commune we funded, the burgomaster told us his commune is the top producer of Irish potatoes in Rwanda, thanks to this program. Whatever part we played in increasing the potato production in the four volatile communes, we did act quickly to provide money directly to the 68 women associations, which gave them the means to purchase quality planting seeds. My colleague reported about his last monitoring visit and the letter a woman offered as he prepared to leave. It was the same woman who had earlier told us about losing her mom, he wrote. By this letter, we want to thank WIT for the sincere love that you have shown to our women. Mamas of Ruweri were close to death when you first arrived. Now women, widows, and their orphans sing a song of praise. This letter is a small nothing, but it means a lot because it comes from the depth of our hearts. We weren't the only organization working in these communes, but perhaps the only one providing funds directly to the women's associations that allowed them to make their own determinations. The Prefet commended us for channeling funds directly to the beneficiaries and not passing them through intermediaries. For many of the women, it was the first time they had set foot in a bank, much less opened a bank account. Many of the women, especially heads of household, now have the wherewithal to make their own financial decisions and are not dependent. Tiny amounts of well-directed funds, often less than $50, allowed over 150,000 women in 1,800 associations to return to life and increase their political influence. WIT sought to decentralize and give rural women the means to make decisions that affect their communities. With repayment rates between 85% and 90%, they took charge. U.S. taxpayers made this possible, and I believe we got our money's worth. Not just because it was a modest amount of money, but because it helped to set one more country on earth in a peaceful direction, something that always benefits the U.S. in its alliances, trade, and reduction of threats. Rwanda still has plenty of challenges we can talk about more later, but the U.S. helped the restart. Despite the post-genocide efforts in Rwanda, the Genocide Prevention Task Force that Madeleine Albright and Bill Cohen chaired in 2008 concluded that the U.S., quote, does not have an established, coherent policy for preventing and responding to genocide and mass atrocities. We have tried, but only with limited success. There is a justice cascade underway, but it is birthing. After a deep involvement in the development of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, a venue that could bring kings and commoners, generals and foot soldiers, leaders and followers to justice, the U.S. did not ratify its membership. My standard criticism of the U.S. government and our failures to include others or think across our own interests does not extend to the negotiation of international agreements. At times, our attention to anything that might harm the U.S. is painful and extreme. I saw that often as one of the U.S. ambassadors in New York. Whenever any issue arises, the U.S. has a point of view. Often it reflects meticulous detail. Arguments from multiple departments reach the State Department and, along with congressional opinions, make their way into the U.S. opinion. Citizens and bloggers make their presence felt. As a friend once said about USAID, U.S. positions are often the result of, quote, maximum feasible democracy, especially when State Department lawyers are involved. Within the rooms where nations gather, the U.S. has an outsized presence. Beyond the team of negotiators, there is a distinct respect and occasional deference for the U.S. position. This can range from such mundane issues as the length of interventions in a public meeting to the approval of a Secretary General candidate. Others pay attention to the U.S., and we like it. In the case of the International Criminal Court, the U.S. has produced an odd mix of influence and disengagement. While central to the agreement, the U.S. has neither joined nor ratified it. Still, even as a non-member state, the U.S. can determine a judge's approval. America's invisible hand extends well beyond the influence of others. In 2011, President Obama established the Atrocities Prevention Board. The president stated, quote, preventing mass atrocities and genocide is a core national security interest and a core moral responsibility of the United States. I was a member, and we raised the threat of lost lives in meetings throughout the U.S. government. Yet, when faced with Syria, the administration looked the other way. Diminished, the board focused on small places with modest political profiles. I still believe in pursuing as many corrective routes as possible. They may start as experiments, but raising the awareness of our citizenry and its public servants will save lives and strengthen America's leadership. America made a difference even at a late date in Rwanda. As Frank Coffin pointed out in his book, America's contributions since the Marshall Plan and the successful rebuilding of Europe and Japan are significant. I know that the U.S. saves lives and improves lives, attesting to the humanity that Frank Coffin exemplified. Perhaps in the Q&A period we can talk about my more recent work in Kenya, Nigeria, Burma, North Central America, and Syria. I am on the side of American ingenuity and taking risks to advance peace, and I hope we can explore some of that later. Experiments are worth pursuing, even if they never become precedents. It is possible to move on from war and embrace peace. Mine is a pragmatic desire to advance peaceful democratic change after seeing conflicts in over 40 places. I remain optimistic that the U.S. can be a promoter of peace through local people. It is not easy. I have failed more often than not, but I believe that America's advantageous position should be a positive and catalytic force. We will fulfill our promise when we balance our grand ideals with an outsized humanity. That is the example of Frank Coffin. He knew that when people have the freedom of speech, movement, and to gather, that their promise will flourish. He knew that if there is a circuit-riding judge and a straight-shooting sheriff, that some kind of justice is possible. He knew that these are all of God's children and that their well-being will have a direct and long-standing relationship to that of our children and grandchildren. He would appreciate that when we get to know a place and its people, we make better decisions. When we focus our efforts, we have impact. When we measure progress, accept failure, and make course corrections, we improve our chances for success. When we keep our institutions agile, we will not shoot ourselves in the foot. These are my core lessons, and I believe that America can do this work ever better. In a wonderful Neil Allen Jr. lecture at Maine's 175th birthday in 1995, Judge Coffin came up with his own Maine pantheon of public leaders. He asked, why should we do this? Quote, I think the answer is one of enlightened self-interest, to restore the element of faith in ourselves and in our capacity to govern that has been missing in a time of disillusion, distrust, and cynicism. I hope that my talk renews some of your sense of the good that the United States might do. Thank you again for this wonderful opportunity to salute Frank Coffin's deep humanity and to think about its global application to the expansion of peace. It's nice to get a hug from the dean. Everybody should accept this invitation just for that reason.
So now you are able to ask the ambassador questions, and you'll see on either aisle there are some microphones. Please don't be bashful. And as I promised, it is pretty early. So let's take about 10 or 15 minutes to have a discussion. I welcome you to the microphone.
You want to answer that?
The question came from the front row, but he wasn't at a microphone, so I couldn't hear him.
Do you want to talk about that, and then I'll come back? Probably people didn't hear. He would like to hear your how you're going to resolve the problems in Syria. That's not what I was going to ask.
So yeah, and I didn't wear my hearing aids either. Well, I mean, again, it's not an easy one, and it actually reminds me, the first part of the answer is something I remember from a conversation I had with Ed Muskie. I think at that point I was the state party chairman. I was sitting at one of these head tables, and my dinner partner was Ed Muskie. By this point in his career, I'm not sure that he ever was that great at it. He was not devoted to small talk. And I was trying to get something out of him, and I remember asking him about Central America, and he looked at me a little bit irritated, and he said something like, well, none of these things get better with age. So I do think that the the bad news on Syria was that there probably were some more opportunities at an earlier stage. I do believe that I happen to be a supporter of President Obama's taking the red line issue to the Congress. I think that the Congress has been overlooked way too many times. I also think that we probably should have thought of some retributive strikes that would have been highly pinpointed and would have been the result of actions taken by Assad's regime rather than anything that we initiated ourselves. So, because I do think that this particular regime is actually quite a bit more rational than the Gaddafi or the Iraqi or Saddam. This is a group of adults who have complete control over almost everything, and you couldn't really say that about the other two. So I think that those opportunities might have helped, because the opposition, which I happen to think was the most serious group of people that I ever ran into in any of the conflict settings, and we did a lot of work with them trying to make them more capable, including helping them start 12 FM radio stations inside the country. So for the first time in decades, there was actually independent, reliable news that people could learn about their countries, and early warnings on threats, on bombings and whatnot. But they were taking over vast areas of the country, but they had no ability to govern because there's no tax revenue during this kind of a situation. They didn't have any way to pay. And we took a number of initiatives that helped, little steps, but the bombing was the issue in Syria. And the fact that nothing was ever really done about the bombing meant that you really couldn't get on top of any other part of the problem. So I don't know if that answers your question. It doesn't answer it in the sense of what could we do or what should we do. I think at this point, I still have grave doubts about trying to make peace with Assad. I do think that he is one of the most negative forces in the world. He is the source of terror in his region, and he's totally self-serving, of a country that's really full of capable people, and actually a much higher education level and a lot of other things than you find in the region. So that's an ambiguous answer, but it's a highly ambiguous problem. I actually had a chance to ask this question of President Obama directly, which I didn't get to do on any other occasion that I remember. And he was very troubled by it, but he didn't really have I just never felt that it was one of the top 5 or 10 issues on his mind, considering that he had all the domestic issues and a couple of wars, and he still was worried about climate change, and you can't really do these things on the side. They're very consuming. So I'm happy to have follow-up questions on that, because I'm sure that generated 40 questions, but maybe not the first one. This is a Frank Coffin's biographer right here, so this is pretty amazing.
I was going to give you an easy one, Rick.
Good.
You mentioned Burma. There we seem to have an example of a genocide unfolding even as you speak of genocide tonight. What is the U.S. doing? What could it do? What should it do to deal with an unfolding atrocity, mass atrocity?
So the good that we do almost always right away in these situations is humanitarian assistance. And so we're undoubtedly, we're almost always the largest contributor to helping the people stay alive somehow. But this problem starts with the Rohingya not being recognized as people by either country, Bangladesh or Burma, Myanmar. And when people are put into a category of not being people, not being human beings, it's quite easy for others to kill them and to carry on the way they have. I do think that the U.S. response to the last few days has been a positive one, but I think we've been a bit slow to acknowledge this, because we had such hopes for the progress of Burma after basically several decades in the wilderness. And the reason that my office initially got involved in Burma is that we felt that the United States had 3 interests in Burma. Number one was we wanted to see the expansion of democracy. Number two, we wanted to see the end to all of these little ethnic, not so little ethnic conflicts that had gone on for years on the border of Burma with different ethnic groups. And number three, we wanted to do business in a country that's clearly going to do quite well over the next decade or two. It was my assumption that the U.S. would take care of 1 and 3 quite well, but number 2 was going to be left behind because it's troubling. And that's pretty much proven to be the case. Not that the United States is not the most aggressive in the Burmese economic market, but when I was there and the ambassador had a chance to have dinner with me or the president of Google on a certain night, which one do you think he did? So we have an awareness of these things, and I just think in this particular case, the Burmese ruling class, which is made up of a group of people that consider themselves Burmese, do have no respect for the Rohingya, and they do not recognize them as people. And until that happens, it's going to be very hard to do anything more than provide humanitarian assistance or condemnation. Yes, sir.
Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity. And I would like just to thank you so much for this rich expose, which is very, very important to us. I want to just be back to a little bit about the Rwanda, the genocide, 1994 Tutsi genocide in Rwanda. I'm from Rwanda.
Yes.
So, you know that the 1994 genocide has impacted a lot, not only Rwanda as a country, but all neighbors countries, which I can cite some of them: Congo, Republic Democratic of Congo, Burundi, and other many. So, my question will be: even right now, people are suffering from what happened in Rwanda in 1994. As the impact of the genocide. We do have many things happening in Congo right now from what happened in Rwanda. Am I clear about that?
I didn't hear that last sentence. Could you help?
So I would like to, I want to just say that, you know, from what happened in Rwanda, from the genocide, 1994
Yes.
genocide, there is a lot of negative impact.
Yes.
Caused by the genocide.
Yes.
The effects of the genocide. So, and I believe that the U.S. until now is being involved and is very influent in the region. So, and there is a lot of, now we do have ambassadors, we do have the UN special staff down there. So, in your perspective, what should be the message for those people to voice out, first of all, to prevent all those mass killing, which is still happening until now, and what could be the solution in the future, and everyone, what should be the role of everyone to decrease those mass killing and the genocide?
So let me make sure that, are you mostly asking about the killings around Rwanda in the region, so the destabilization of the former genocidaire, or are you concerned with killing as well inside of Rwanda?
So my concern is it's abroad.
The region.
Just, you know, what's happening right now, we do have those, the current leadership in Rwanda, Congo, Burundi. Now it's going far from what they were claiming.
Yeah.
And we are now, it's just like a cycle of what happened, all the time happening. So I want to know, what have we learned and what could we do just to prevent?
This question is not that much easier than the Syria one. Because, you know, because the genocide was the result of decades of not just the early colonial interventions, but the dominance of sort of a Tutsi superiority in the country as well that went for decades. And then when the majority Hutus finally had their opportunity, they used it quite violently. But some of that sense of Tutsi superiority is still a destabilizing factor inside of Rwanda. Rwanda has made a very independent choice. I believe that they've decided to sort of be the Israel of Central Africa, of Africa. That they've just said, we're going to be a strong, independent force and factor, and we're going to just take a path that almost nobody else will pursue in this part of the world. And so they've invested heavily. They are a donor darling as well now. They have a higher level of technology and of education. Lots of good things are happening there, but there's still this undercurrent of not having addressed the core societal division. I don't know that they are as destabilizing for the region as they might have once been, but these populations of former genocidists are a real source of problem, and the United Nations has not been able to do a very good job of rooting out the problem, even though it's, up until recently, was the largest single UN peacekeeping force in the world. So it's a pretty tough area to begin with because Congo has not been well run for decades. And I think only its size has kept it from going through the kind of turbulence that Burundi and Rwanda are going through. Burundi has not settled that question either, the Hutu-Tutsi question. And Uganda now is onto its, I don't know, 4th decade or whatever of under a single president. So issues of succession, issues of access of populations, natural divisions that were exploited through forced labor, which in most places is called slavery over decades. These are all really difficult problems to move on quickly with. The social engineering experiment in Rwanda is among the most dramatic in the world. Whether it will succeed unless the president finds a way to groom successors and really address some of the core divisions, I'm not sure, but it's definitely on a better developmental path than it has been since well before the genocide. So, again.
Quite appropriately, our last question is going to go to the chair of the Frank M. Coffin Speaker Selection Committee.
Jeff, could you just give me a multiple choice or a true false?
It'll be multiple choice. It'll be a softball. How's that? So you've mentioned, and Judge Kotecha mentioned, you've been in 40-plus countries of conflict, and Dean Conway in her remarks talked about the rule of law. And the first place you went was Haiti. I was there last year with 4 other environmental lawyers, and we were invited to try to help them develop an environmental law system. What we realized after a week was that it's really hard to do that when there is not a rule of law generally, culture, not just sort of one particular area. Sure. And so there are a number of countries in the world where there isn't much rule of law, but then there's others where maybe the law is used very oppressively, very heavy-handed, or almost dictatorially. And so there's a range of countries like that. Given where we are now in 2017 and the US seeming to back away from being proactive as much as maybe it was in other times, what do you see are there institutions that can step in, or what can be done about countries that struggle with the rule of law, either having too little or maybe too much? That was multiple choice, wasn't it?
I think it was too much. The answer is too much, right? Is that right? The answer is C. I don't get to give these kinds of exams to my students. Well, I happen, in my field, there are people who think that there's kind of a 4-pillar system for building a new society or renewing a society after war. And one of those 4 pillars is justice. And I happen to think the first one is security and personal safety. The second one is law and justice. justice and reconciliation. The third is economic and social development. And the fourth is, where's Governor Perry when I need him? So I happen to think that the rule of law piece is the toughest one. And generally, for example, when we did massive surveys in Afghanistan, that was an area that did not improve at all. As people began to feel safer, as women's positions got better, as we built courthouses and trained judges and started programs, the public response in that area never improved at all after whatever else we were doing. I think there are lots of other things we could be doing better. We almost never spend time on police in a place unless there's a drug program involved with it, and then it's a drug program, not a police program. I mean, the police are just absolutely invaluable to people feeling safe in a society and really the first line of response. And we have never, because we have such a highly decentralized police system in our country, we've defaulted mostly to countries that have centralized police operations as the way to build new police forces. I happen to think that doesn't work in most places because it's very hard to build from the center out. You actually have to create capacity all over the place before you can do something in the center. So I think there's plenty more that we could do there, but the good news is that there's much greater awareness. There's a much stronger feeling among people of these places that this is something they would like to see. I have yet to run into anybody anywhere on earth who says, I'd rather have somebody's boot in my face than be able to walk freely in this country. It's just, I mean, that's not an elevated concept. And so I'm hopeful about the promise and the potential of that subject, but I'm not yet. I think we've done things in a very stilted way, and oftentimes it's been through a narrow lens, like our soldiers are getting killed, which it matters a lot, or there's a drug problem here, as opposed to there's this much larger cultural change. And as we all know, cultural change is much, much, much harder than reorganizing boxes or creating new capacities. So again, I feel badly that none of these questions have been answered but I'm happy to stay and try to clarify if that would help. Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure.
So as is becoming our custom, we try to find an appropriate award for the commitment that you give us with the Coffin Lecture. And we chose this world clock as opposed to a tennis ball.
Good choice.
We know that you enjoy tennis, but we thought that it was important to recognize your flight around the globe, bringing international peace building to local communities.
Thanks so much. I'll take another hug. Thank you. My former business partners are here, and they would, I'm sure, happily say that I could use a watch. So, thank you.
So I'd like to thank everyone for coming to the 25th Annual Frank M. Coffin Lecture on Law and Public Service. I'd like to do two things. First, give you a teaser about what to expect next year. We will have a presentation of the 26th annual lecture by John C. Cruden, former Assistant Attorney General for the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the United States Department of Justice. I also want to ask one thing of you before you leave. I ask you, not for money, rather, I really want to build up the social media presence of the law school. In that vein, I would love it if you would go to our website, www.mainlaw.maine.edu, look at our website, check out our programs, and our fabulous faculty, staff, and students. And also then, bookmark us, and follow us on Twitter. At Humane Law, really easy, at Humane Law. And then follow me because I have a bit of an ego, at Humane Law Dean. And as I promised, it is 8:29. Have a wonderful evening.